Hello and welcome to African Elements. I'm Darius Spearman. In this episode, what is Black Studies, also referred to as Africana Studies? We'll look at the origins of a relatively new academic discipline. How did Black Studies come about, and how is it distinct from other academic disciplines? Also, what are the challenges faced by scholars, academics, and students of Black Studies in higher education? All that coming up next. Black Studies is a relatively new academic field. It spans across disciplines, encompassing the social sciences such as history, sociology, psychology, and political science, as well as the humanities, including music, art, literature, and religious studies. Different academic institutions may use different terms to describe it depending upon their particular focus, but whether it goes by the name Black Studies, African American Studies, or Africana Studies, the discipline is generally rooted in a radical movement for fundamental education reform. No matter what one may call it, the discipline of Black Studies is a direct challenge to the European-centered framework and its justification of the subjugation, enslavement, and colonization of African people and their descendants throughout the world. The reframing of the world through a European lens has confronted people of African descent, and even people on the African continent, with an identity crisis, as the continent has been transformed by colonization, and Black people have been stripped of their cultural heritage, history, and language. Black Studies, then, has become a way of reshaping and reframing the experience of Black people, as opposed to having their experience, as well as their very identities, reframed and viewed through the lens of their colonial oppressors. The comments of the well-known 18th century philosopher David Hume are fairly typical as an example of how Africa and its people were framed in the eyes of the European colonizers. As a footnote in his Essay and Treatises, written in 1768, he writes, "I'm apt to suspect the Negroes to be naturally inferior to the white. There never was a civilized nation of any other complexion than white, nor even any individual eminent either in action or speculation. No ingenious manufactures amongst them, no arts, no sciences." The need to reclaim one's heritage in the face of such a disparaging mainstream narrative is at the very core of the development of Black Studies as an academic discipline. What has been the impact of the reframing of African identity through European eyes? Malcolm X explains.
Why should the black man in America concern himself, since we've been away from the African continent for 400 years, 300 or 400 years? Why should we concern ourselves? What impact does what happened to them have upon us? Number one, first you have to realize that up until 1959, Africa was dominated by the colonial powers, and by the colonial powers of Europe having complete control over Africa, they projected the image of Africa negatively. They projected Africa always in a negative light. Jungles, savages, cannibals, nothing civilized. And naturally, it was so negative until it was negative to you and me. And you and I began to hate it. We didn't want anybody to tell us anything about Africa, and much less call us an African. And in hating Africa and hating the African, we ended up even hating ourselves without even realizing it. Because you can't hate the roots of a tree and not hate the tree. You can't hate your origin and not end up hating yourself. You can't hate Africa and not hate yourself. And you show me one of these people over here who have been thoroughly brainwashed, who has a negative attitude toward Africa, and I'll show you one that has a negative attitude toward himself. You can't have a negative attitude toward yourself, a positive attitude toward yourself, and a negative attitude toward Africa at the same time. To the same degree that your attitude, that your understanding of an attitude toward Africa becomes positive, you'll find that your understanding of and your attitude toward yourself will also become positive. And this is what the white man knows.
As we can see, the critical issue here is the power to define. Since historically the Black experience has been defined through the European lens, at least over the past 400 or so years, Black Studies is largely an effort to reclaim and redefine the experience of persons of African descent. That's exactly the reason why naming is so important. The different departments that have sprung up throughout the country do vary in the terms that they use to describe themselves. Whether they go by the name Black Studies, Africana Studies, or African American Studies, the process of naming is very deliberate and carries a particular meaning for the individuals who undertook to establish the various academic departments. The different focus that each of these departments may have makes naming a matter of political control, which is a critical principle to self-determination and self-definition. African American Studies focuses on persons of African descent throughout the Americas, including North, Central, and South America, as well as the Caribbean, as well as countries like Newfoundland and Greenland. So the term African American makes African American Studies a more historically specific branch of the discipline that describes the experience of Africans in the Western Hemisphere with a relatively narrow lens. While there tends to be some focus on the continent of Africa, there's no specific focus on persons of African descent in Europe or Asia. The term Black Studies represents a more politicized vision of the discipline. As we'll see, the institutionalization of Black Studies, that is, the formal establishment of Black Studies within academic settings, came about largely as a result of what is known in the 1960s as the Black Power movement. Malcolm X and the Nation of Islam, in an attempt to reclaim their sense of self-definition, urged the so-called Negro to become black. Black became redefined as a popular positive affirmation of self. Black Studies reflects the politicization of the discipline that is largely aimed at the discovery, dissemination of information pertaining to what black people have undergone and achieved, and the use of education and knowledge to defend and vindicate the race against its detractors. This reframing was a symbolic victory for the masses of black people, but it also carries with it certain problems and challenges, as we'll see later. Like Black Studies, Africana Studies is not limited to the experience of persons of African descent on the continent of Africa or the Western Hemisphere, but is much broader and focuses on the African diaspora as a whole. The African diaspora refers to the disbursement of persons of African descent throughout the globe. It's well known that persons of African descent had a presence in ancient Greece and Rome, as well as widespread contact between Africans and Asians via the Indian Ocean. There's some evidence to suggest that there was a pre-Columbian disbursement of Africans across the Atlantic well before 1492. The systematic and widespread dispersal of Africans throughout the globe, however, took place on a far more massive scale in the past 400 years as a result of the Atlantic slave trade and subsequent colonization of the continent of Africa. Africana Studies focuses on the Pan-African links and experiences of persons of African descent not only in the continent of Africa and in the Americas, but in places like England, France, Germany, Spain, Italy, as well as Russia and various parts of Europe and Asia. It does so, however, without the political context that you find in the Black Power movement. Aside from terminology, Black Studies, African American Studies, and Africana Studies are similar in that they've come about largely in response to systemic misrepresentation of the experience of persons of African descent in such a way as to popularize the notion that they're inferior. It is in response to miseducation, which, as Malcolm X explained, has redirected the worldview of black people in such a way as to prevent them from identifying with their true history, cultural self-awareness, and well-being, and diseducation, by which black people have been deprived of access to education altogether. As such, a core value is an underlying social mission that requires the application of theory to methodology and the combination of knowledge to activism toward practical resolution of issues in the black community. That's the reason why Black Studies has always been historically so closely aligned with activism and social justice. Key developments in the establishment of Black Studies include a period of renewed hope between 1945 and 1955. During that time, legal victories such as the Supreme Court's Brown v. Board of Education decision in 1954, which struck down segregation, gave blacks a sense of optimism in terms of the direction the country was going. Additionally, the GI Bill allowed many African Americans who were returning from World War II as veterans to have most, if not all, of their college tuition paid for by the federal government. Within the first few years of its passage, the reality of a college education combined with growing desegregation of public institutions led to an unprecedented growth in the number of African American students. Along with the influx of African American students and the gradual breakdown of legal barriers, however, a number of other factors combine that encourage the institutionalization of Black studies in higher education. Why would the power structure, which had been so resistant to curricular and structural change, now all of a sudden seem so much more open to change? The gains of the civil rights movement, that is, the desegregation of the armed forces and the Brown versus Board of Education decision, among many other efforts, combined with two other forces, civil unrest and the Cold War, that brought about a shift with regard to the stance that academia in general held toward the establishment of Black studies as a discipline. The period of civil rights also overlapped a period of militancy, unrest, sit-ins, and demands for acknowledgement and justice on college campuses, which increased between 1966 and 1968. In May 1967, students at Jackson State College in Mississippi fought with police for 2 nights. The National Guard was called, and 1 person was killed. On March 19, 1968, a sit-in at Howard University became the first building takeover on a college campus. By this time, the philosophy of the Black Power movement and Black nationalism were about as firmly entrenched in the Black community as the civil rights movement as a response to racism and systematic oppression. Uprisings in the Los Angeles community of Watts in 1965 and in Newark, New Jersey in 1967, as well as uprisings in cities nationwide in the wake of the assassinations of Malcolm X and Martin Luther King in 1965 and 1968, respectively, had the effect of reframing Black studies as a national security issue. Perhaps some systemic change would be necessary in order to prevent widespread unrest in what were formerly exclusively white institutions that were becoming increasingly desegregated. Another national security threat also loomed that forced or at least encouraged academic institutions to consider implementing Black studies into their curricula. The period immediately following World War II through the 1980s ushered in the era of the Cold War. As most of Europe and much of Asia lay in shambles, the United States and Soviet Union emerged from the conflict as the world's 2 emerging superpowers and as bitter rivals to one another. As the 2 superpowers competed on a global scale for strategic and economic dominance, the United States became increasingly concerned about supporting regimes friendly to its capitalistic interest in order to undercut its communist rival. At home, the United States became increasingly concerned, some might say paranoid, over the threat of communist infiltration from within the country. As a result, the efforts of the U.S. government agencies to systematically root out the communist threat from within took the form of the infamous McCarthy hearings of 1954 and the FBI counterintelligence programs intended to disrupt and destroy organizations it saw as subversive, such as the Black Panther Party. At the same time, implementing programs of Black studies in higher education was seen as a necessary concession in order to keep Black students from going communist. It's within that context that Merritt Community College in Oakland, California, established the first organized Black studies curriculum in the 1965-1966 academic school year. San Francisco State University approved the nation's first 4-year curriculum in Black studies in 1967-1968 academic year. As a relatively new and developing discipline, Black studies faces many challenges, dilemmas, and paradoxes that scholars, students, and academics must grapple with. Among them, given that Black studies is both a response to and a means of addressing social inequality, how do we get around the fact that social inequality is largely a barrier between Black studies and those whose needs it's intended to address? How do we achieve an educational impact on a critical mass of people in the face of disproportionate access to higher education? What is or should be the relationship between Black people inside the universities and those who may never make it that far? How is it possible for Black studies departments to remain institutionalized in higher education and still preserve their own core set of values? What is the cost of integration, being seen as legitimate in the eyes of the establishment? Does institutionalization and mainstreaming of Black studies compromise a Black studies agenda, especially given that Black studies places an emphasis on solutions to group problems in a context of a social climate that values individual success as opposed to group liberation? What about gender? If Black studies was established as a means to address the disservice of Eurocentric male-dominated thought and social practice, patriarchal male dominance within Black studies must also be addressed if Black studies is not to fall victim to the same type of disservice. Patriarchal male dominance is part of the problem I've referenced earlier in terms of the political vision of Black studies and the Black Power movement. If Black studies and Black power are a response to and remedy to Eurocentric notions of power, then how do we respond without simply becoming a mirror image of the oppressor? If the goal is to be equal with whites, does that mean adopting the same notions of power, top-down, male-dominated? Or can we develop notions of power that are independent of Eurocentric and oppressive colonial models of power? What is a responsible Black studies research agenda? Who has the power to decide? Who sets the priorities and determines the means to carry them out? Lastly, Black studies programs were developed as a challenge to what remains a Western-dominated Eurocentric vision of higher education. Yet it is in these very institutions where Black studies resides. A problem with Black nationalism in general is that, given that it was established as a means to develop autonomy and self-determination, how is that possible, given that Black studies in higher education relies exclusively on allocations from established institutional budgets? Consider the case in 2008 of Karen Salazar, the Los Angeles school teacher who was fired for being too Afrocentric.
Protests in support of dismissal Los Angeles School District high school teacher Karen Salazar have increased this week. She's a second-year English teacher at Jordan High School in Watts. Last month she was told her contract would be renewed because she was presenting a biased view, would not be renewed because she was presenting a biased view of the curriculum and indoctrinating her students with Afrocentrism. Her course material included board-approved texts like the writings of Malcolm X and Langston Hughes. Last week a student took issue with the negative characterization of Salazar's teaching.
She encourages her students to continue on. She gives them the push. She doesn't give up on her students. She says, okay, you're struggling in my class, I will take time off. I will help you after school. Most teachers don't even do that. And the fact that she's teaching us about our culture and things that are relevant to us, that's what they are afraid of. They're scared of a teacher who does that, because that involves critical thinking. They don't like students who question or to think critically. They just want students to absorb everything and then to regurgitate back to them.
Jordan High School officials refused to comment when we contacted them and said the issue was an internal matter relating to personnel, but the case of Karen Salazar is not unique. We turn now to another story that could have a chilling effect on education in Arizona public schools. A legislative panel in Arizona endorsed a proposal in April that would cut state funding for public schools whose courses denigrate American values and the teachings of Western civilization. The measure would also prohibit students of state-funded universities and community colleges from forming groups based on, in whole or in part, on the race of their members. Critics say the bill would essentially destroy the state's Mexican-American or Chicano studies programs, as well as student groups such as the Movimiento Estudiantil Chicano de Aztlán or MECHA. Karen Salazar, tell us the latest.
Hi. I guess the latest, as you said, yes, my contract has been denied for renewal. So effective June 30th, I will be out of a contract from LAUSD. The latest would be that about 3 to 4 weeks ago, I received my official evaluation from the school. And it was actually a satisfactory evaluation. It was a positive evaluation. Unfortunately, they never gave me a copy of that evaluation, even though I signed it. So after, pressing the administration to give me a copy of that evaluation for weeks, and I had the union press them as well, this week I was given an evaluation. Unfortunately, it was not the evaluation that I signed. It was not the evaluation that I signed. It was actually a different evaluation, completely different form. My evaluative marks of satisfactory had now been turned into unsatisfactory.
And their major beef with you?
The major beef, originally they told me that the reason for not renewing my contract was that I was presenting a biased view of the curriculum. They later told district officials that I was indoctrinating students with Afrocentrism. Later they said that it was due to an over-teached position, too many English teachers at my school. Now the latest is they're saying that I'm not teaching state standards.
Karen Salazar, can you talk about the charge that your teachings were too Afrocentric? Talk about what you taught.
Sure. There was actually one lesson in particular that's been extremely controversial. I used a 3-page excerpt from the autobiography of Malcolm X, which is an LAUSD approved text. It's widely used around the country, in other countries as well. I used a 3-page excerpt, standards-based. They never denied that it was standards-based. But the administrator who observed
when
my
you
class,
say standards-based, in LAUSD, Los Angeles United School District, but LA standards-based?
Standards-based for the California Content Standards for English Language Arts.
Go ahead.
So it was a standards-based lesson. The administrator who came and observed my class later wrote in an evaluation, this is a written evaluation that goes into my file, that I was brainwashing students and imposing extremist views on them based on this lesson. So that's one of the controversial lessons, I guess, that I am being accused of indoctrinating students with Afrocentrism with. I did have a mentor teacher observe the same exact lesson that same day, just coincidentally, because she is my mentor teacher. She comes in periodically to observe my lesson, and she took away something completely different from that lesson than what the administrator did.
How many times were you evaluated compared to other teachers?
Wow, this year alone I've been evaluated at least 15 times. Comparatively, the average evaluations for teachers is between 1 and 3 times, so, you know, it's substantially more.
Do you have any recourse to reverse your dismissal?
At this point, we are working, students are organizing with the union. We're working with the Association of Raza Educators. We're working to pressure the district to review this decision, both at the school board level and district official level.
Today is graduation?
Today is graduation, yes.
Will you be there?
Yes, I will.
Is it possible to challenge a Western-style curriculum with its emphasis on tests, quizzes, and individual achievement with an alternative African-centered approach that favors group discussion and peer-to-peer mentoring? Is it possible to put forward that challenge from within the very Westernized institutional settings in which Black studies reside? These are the challenges that Black studies and this program, African Elements, will be addressing. That does it for this show. Thank you for joining me, and be sure to check in with me next time for a look at the significance of Black studies. Is Black studies relevant only to Black students? What does Black studies have to offer academia as a whole? Why should Asian, Latino, or white students engage Black studies? We'll address that next time on African Elements.